Section 13 of From the Tower Window of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Schneider. Section 13. Wolfert Webber, or Golden Dreams, A Tale of Old New York, by Washington Irving, Part 2. Adventure of the Black Fisherman. Everybody knows Black Sam, the old Negro fisherman, or as he is commonly called, Mud Sam, who has fished about the Sound for the last half-century. It is now many years since Sam, having finished his day's work at an early hour, was fishing one still summer evening just about the neighborhood of Hellgate. He was in a light skiff, and being well acquainted with the currents and eddies, had shifted his station according to the shifting of the tide, but in the eagerness of his sport he did not see that the tide was rapidly ebbing, until the roaring of the whirlpools and eddies warned him of his danger, and he had some difficulty in shooting his skiff from among the rocks and breakers, and getting to the point of Blackwell's Island. Here he cast anchor for some time, waiting the turn of the tide to enable him to return homewards. As the night set in, it grew blustering and gusty. Dark clouds came bundling up in the west, and now and then a growl of thunder or a flash of lightning told that a summer storm was at hand. Sam pulled over, therefore, under the lee of Manhattan Island, and coasting along came to a snug nook, just under a steep beetling rock, where he fastened his skiff to the root of a tree that shot out from a cleft, and spread its broad branches like a canopy over the water. The gust came scouring along, the wind threw up the river in white surges, the rain rattled among the leaves, the thunder bellowed worse than that which is now bellowing, the lightning seemed to lick up the surges of the stream. But Sam, snugly sheltered under rock and tree, lay crouching in his skiff, rocking upon the billows until he fell asleep. When he awoke all was quiet. The gust had passed away, and only now and then a faint gleam of lightning in the east showed which way it had gone. The night was dark and moonless, and from the state of the tide, Sam concluded it was near midnight. He was on the point of making loose his skiff to return homewards, when he saw a light gleaming along the water from a distance, which seemed rapidly approaching. As it drew near, he perceived it came from a lantern in the bow of a boat gliding along under shadow of the land. It pulled up in a small cove close to where he was. A man jumped on shore, and searching about with the lantern, exclaimed, "This is the place. Here's the iron ring." The boat was then made fast, and the man, returning on board, assisted his comrades in conveying something heavy on shore. As the light gleamed among them, Sam saw that they were 5 stout, desperate-looking fellows, in red woolen caps, with a leader in a 3-cornered hat, and that some of them were armed with dirks, or long knives, and pistols. They talked low to one another in some outlandish tongue, which he could not understand. On landing, they made their way among the bushes, taking turns to relieve each other in lugging their burden up the rocky bank. Sam's curiosity was now fully aroused, so leaving his skiff he clambered silently up a ridge that overlooked their path. They had stopped to rest for a moment, and the leader was looking about among the bushes with his lantern. "Have you brought the spades?" said one. "They are here," replied another, who had them on his shoulder. "We must dig deep, where there will be no risk of discovery," said a third. A cold chill ran through Sam's veins. He fancied he saw before him a gang of murderers about to bury their victim. His knees smote together. In his agitation he shook the branch of a tree with which he was supporting himself as he looked over the edge of the cliff. "What's that?" cried one of the gang. "Some one stirs among the bushes." The lantern was held up in the direction of the noise. One of the redcaps cocked a pistol and pointed it toward the very place where Sam was standing. He stood motionless, breathless. Fortunately his dingy complexion was in his favor, and made no glare among the leaves. "'Tis no one," said the man with the lantern. "What a plague! You would not fire off your pistol and alarm the country?" The pistol was uncocked, the burden was resumed, and the party slowly toiled along the bank. Sam watched them as they went. the light sending back fitful gleams through the dripping bushes, and it was not till they were fairly out of sight that he ventured to draw breath freely. He now thought of getting back to his boat and making his escape out of reach of such dangerous neighbors, but curiosity was all powerful. He hesitated and lingered and listened. By and by he heard the strokes of spades. "They are digging a grave," said he to himself, and the cold sweat started upon his forehead. Every stroke of a spade, as it sounded through the silent groves, went to his heart. It was evident there was as little noise made as possible. Everything had an air of terrible mystery and secrecy. Sam could not resist an impulse, in spite of every danger, to steal nearer to the scene of mystery and overlook the midnight fellows at their work. He crawled along cautiously, therefore, inch by inch, stepping with the utmost care among the dry leaves, lest their rustling should betray him. He came at length to where a steep rock intervened between him and the gang, for he saw the light of their lantern shining up against the branches of the trees on the other side. Sam slowly and silently clambered up the surface of the rock, and raising his head above its naked edge, beheld the villains immediately below him, and so near that though he dreaded discovery, he dared not withdraw lest the least movement should be heard. In this way he remained, with his round black face peering above the edge of the rock, like the sun just emerging over the horizon, or the round-cheeked moon on the dial of a clock. The red caps had nearly finished their work. The grave was filled up, and they were carefully replacing the turf. This done, they scattered dry leaves over the place. "And now," said the leader, "I defy the devil himself to find it out." "The murderers!" exclaimed Sam involuntarily. The whole gang started, and looking up beheld the round black head of Sam just above them, his white eyes strained half out of their orbits, his white teeth chattering, and his whole visage shining with cold perspiration. "We're discovered!" cried one. "Down with him!" cried another. Sam heard the cocking of the pistol, but did not pause for the report. He scrambled over rock and stone, through brush and briar, rolled down banks like a hedgehog, scrambled up others like a catamount. In every direction he heard some one or other of the gang hemming him in. At length he reached the rocky ridge along the river. One of the red caps was hard behind him. A steep rock like a wall rose directly in his way. It seemed to cut off all retreat, when fortunately he espied the strong cord-like branch of a grapevine reaching halfway down it. He sprang at it with the force of a desperate man, seized it with both hands, and being young and agile, succeeded in swinging himself to the summit of the cliff. Here he stood in full relief against the sky, when the red cap cocked his pistol and fired. The ball whistled by Sam's head. With the lucky thought of a man in an emergency, he uttered a yell, fell to the ground, and detached at the same time a fragment of rock, which tumbled with a loud splash into the river. "I've done his business," said the red cap to one or two of his comrades as they arrived panting. "He'll tell no tales, except to the fishes in the river." His pursuers now turned to meet their companions. Sam, sliding silently down the surface of the rock, let himself quietly into his skiff, cast loose the fastening, and abandoned himself to the rapid current, which in that place runs like a mill stream, and soon swept him off from the neighborhood. It was not, however, until he had drifted a great distance that he ventured to ply his oars, when he made his skiff dart like an arrow through the strait of Hellgate. Nor did he feel himself thoroughly secure until safely nestled in bed in the cockloft of the ancient house of the Siddons. Here the worthy Peechy Prauw paused to take breath. His auditors remained with open mouths and outstretched necks. "And did Sam never find out what was buried by the red caps?" said Wolfert eagerly, whose mind was haunted by nothing but ingots and doubloons. "Not that I know of," said Peechy. "He had no time to spare from his work, and to tell the truth, he did not like to run the risk of another race among the rocks. But have none of you heard of Father Redcap, who haunts the old burnt farmhouse in the woods on the border of the Sound, near Hellgate?" "Oh, to be sure, I've heard tell of something of that kind, but then I took it some old wives' fable." "Old wives' fable or not," said Peechy Prauw, "that farmhouse stands hard by the very spot. It's been unoccupied time out of mind, and stands at a lonely part of the coast, but those who fish in the neighborhood have often heard strange noises there, and lights have been seen about the wood at night, and an old fellow in a red cap has been seen at the windows more than once, which people take to be the ghost of the body buried there. Once upon a time 3 soldiers took shelter in the building for the night, and rummaged it from top to bottom, when they found old Father Redcap astride of his cider barrel in the cellar, with a jug in one hand and a goblet in the other. He offered them a drink out of his goblet, but just as one of the soldiers was putting it to his mouth, whoo! A flash of fire blazed through the cellar, blinding every mother's son of them for several minutes, and when they recovered their eyesight, jug, goblet, and Redcap had vanished, and nothing but the empty cider barrel remained. The deep interest taken in this conversation by the company had made them unconscious of the uproar abroad among the elements, when suddenly they were electrified by a tremendous clap of thunder. A lumbering crash followed instantaneously, shaking the building to its very foundation. All started from their seats, imagining it the shock of an earthquake, or that old Father Redcap was coming among them in all his terrors. They listened for a moment, but only heard the rain pelting against the windows, and the wind howling among the trees. A sullen pause of the storm, which now rose and sank in gusts, produced a momentary stillness. In this interval the report of a musket was heard, and a long shout, almost like a yell, resounded from the shore. Everyone crowded to the window. Another musket shot was heard, and another long shout mingled wildly with a rising blast of wind. It seemed as if the cry came up from the bosom of the water, for though incessant flashes of lightning spread a light about the shore, no one was to be seen. Suddenly the window of the room overhead was opened, and a loud halloo uttered by the mysterious stranger. Several hailings passed from one party to the other, but in language which none of the company in the bar-room could understand, and presently they heard the window closed, and a great noise overhead, as if all the furniture were pulled and hauled about the room. The negro servant was summoned, and shortly afterwards was seen assisting the veteran to lug the ponderous sea-chest downstairs. The landlord was in amazement. "What, you are not going in the water in such a storm?" "Storm!" said the other scornfully. "Do you call such a sputter of weather a storm?" "You'll get drenched to the skin," said Peechy Prauw. "Thunder and lightning!" exclaimed the veteran. "Don't preach about weather to a man who has cruised in whirlwinds and tornadoes." The obsequious Peechy was again struck dumb. The voice from the water was heard once more in a tone of impatience, and bystanders stared with redoubled awe at this man of storms, who seemed to have come up out of the deep and to be summoned back to it again. As with the assistance of the negro he slowly bore his ponderous sea-chest towards the shore, they eyed it with a superstitious feeling, half doubting whether he were not really about to embark upon it and launch forth upon the wild waves. They followed him at a distance with a lantern. "Douse the light!" roared the hoarse voice from the water. "No one wants light here." "Thunder and lightning!" exclaimed the veteran, turning short upon them. "Back to the house with you!" Wolfert and his companion shrunk back in dismay. Still their curiosity would not allow them entirely to withdraw. A long sheet of lightning now flickered across the waves, and discovered a boat, filled with men, just under a rocky point, rising and sinking with the heaving surges, and swashing the waters at every heave. It was with difficulty held to the rocks by a boat-hook, for the current rushed furiously round the point. The veteran hoisted one end of the lumbering sea-chest on the gunwale of the boat, and seized the handle at the other end to lift it in, when the motion propelled the boat from the shore. The chest slipped off from the gunwale, and sinking into the waves, pulled the veteran headlong after it. A loud shriek was uttered by all on shore, and a volley of execrations by those on board, but boat and men were hurried away by the rushing swiftness of the tide. A pitchy darkness succeeded. Wolfert Webber, indeed, fancied that he distinguished a cry for help, and that he beheld the drowning man beckoning for assistance. But when the lightning again gleamed along the water, all was void. Neither man nor boat was to be seen. Nothing but the dashing and weltering of the waves as they hurried past. The company returned to the tavern to await the subsiding of the storm. They resumed their seats, and gazed on each other with dismay. The whole transaction had not occupied 5 minutes, and not a dozen words had been spoken. "He came," said the landlord, "in a storm, and he went in a storm. He came in the night, and he went in the night. He came nobody knows whence, and he has gone nobody knows where. For aught I know, he is gone to sea once more on his chest, and may land to bother some people on the other side of the world." The thunder gust which had hitherto detained the company came at length to an end. The cuckoo clock in the hall told midnight. Every one pressed to depart, for seldom was such a late hour of the night trespassed on by these quiet burghers. As they sallied forth they found the heavens once more serene. The storm which had lately obscured them had rolled away, and lay piled up in fleecy masses on the horizon, lighted up by the bright crescent of the moon, which looked like a little silver lamp hung up in a palace of clouds. Wolfert Webber had now carried home a fresh stock of stories and notions to ruminate upon. Those accounts of pots of money and Spanish treasures, buried here and there and everywhere about the rocks and bays of these wild shores, made him almost dizzy. As he turned over in his thoughts all that had been told of the singular adventure of the negro fisherman, his imagination gave a totally different complexion to the tale. He saw in the gang of redcaps nothing but a crew of pirates bearing their spoils, and his cupidity was once more awakened by the possibility of at length getting on the traces of some of this lurking wealth. Indeed, his infected fancy tinged everything with gold: caskets of buried jewels, chests of ingots, and barrels of outlandish coins seemed to court him from the concealments, and supplicate him to relieve them from their untimely graves. On making private inquiries about the grounds said to be haunted by Father Redcap, he was more and more confirmed in his surmise. He learned that the place had several times been visited by experienced money diggers, who had heard Black Sam's story, though none of them had met with success. Wolfert Webber was now in a worry of trepidation and impatience, fearful lest some rival adventurer should get a scent of the buried gold. He determined privately to seek out the black fisherman, and get him to serve as guide to the place where he had witnessed the mysterious scene of interment. Sam was easily found. Wolfert found him at his cabin, which was not much larger than a tolerable dog-house. It was rudely constructed of fragments of wrecks and driftwood, and built on the rocky shore at the foot of the old fort, just about what at present forms the point of the battery. Many years had passed away since the time of Sam's youthful adventure, and the snows of many a winter had grizzled the knotty wool upon his head. He perfectly recollected the circumstances, however, and he had often been called upon to relate them. Wolfert's only wish was to secure the old fisherman as a pilot to the spot, and this was readily effected. The long time that had intervened since his nocturnal adventure had effaced all Sam's awe of the place. The tide was adverse to making the expedition by water, and Wolfert was too impatient to get to the land of promise to wait for its turning. They set off therefore by land. A walk of 4 or 5 miles brought them to the edge of the wood, which at that time covered the greater part of the eastern side of the island. Here they struck into a long lane, straggled among trees and bushes, very much overgrown with weeds and mullein stalks, as if but seldom used, and so completely overshadowed as to enjoy but a kind of twilight. Wild vines entangled the trees and flaunted in their faces. Brambles and briars caught their clothes as they passed. The garter snake glided across their path. The spotted toad hopped and waddled before them, and the restless catbird mewed at them from every thicket. Had Wolfert Webber been deeply read in romantic legend, he might have fancied himself entering upon forbidden, enchanted ground, or that these were some of the guardians set to keep watch upon buried treasure. As it was, the loneliness of the place and the wild stories connected with it had their effect upon his mind. On reaching the lower end of the lane, they found themselves near the shore of the Sound, in a kind of amphitheater, surrounded by forest trees. The area had once been a grass plot, but was now shagged with briars and rank weeds. At one end, and just on the river bank, was a ruined building, little better than a heap of rubbish, with a stack of chimneys rising like a solitary tower out of the center. Wolfert had not a doubt that this was the haunted house of Father Redcap, and called to mind the story of Peechy Prauw. The evening was approaching, and the light falling dubiously among the woody places gave a melancholy tone to the scene. The night hawk, wheeling about in the highest regions of the air, emitted his peevish, boding cry. The woodpecker gave a lonely tap now and then on some hollow tree, and the firebird streamed by them with his deep red plumage. They now came to an enclosure that had once been a garden. It extended along the foot of a rocky ridge, but was little better than a wilderness of weeds, with here and there a matted rose bush or a peach or plum tree, grown wild and ragged and covered with moss. At the lower end of the garden they passed a kind of vault on the side of the bank facing the water. It had the look of a root house. The door, though decayed, was still strong, and appeared to have been recently patched up. Wolfert pushed it open. It gave a harsh grating upon its hinges, and striking against something like a box, a rattling sound ensued. Wolfert drew back shuddering, but was reassured on being informed by the negro that this was a family vault, belonging to one of the old Dutch families that owned this estate, an assertion corroborated by the sight of the coffins of various sizes piled within. Sam had been familiar with all these scenes when a boy, and now knew that he could not be far from the place of which they were in quest. They now made their way to the water's edge, scrambling along ledges of rocks that overhung the waves, and obliged often to hold by shrubs and grapevines to avoid slipping into the deep and hurried stream. At length they came to a small cove, or rather indent of the shore. It was protected by steep rocks and overshadowed by a thick copse of oaks and chestnuts, so as to be sheltered and almost concealed. The negro paused, raised his remnant of a hat, and scratched his grizzled poll for a moment, as he regarded this nook. Then suddenly clapping his hands, he stepped exultantly forward and pointed to a large iron ring, stapled firmly in the rock, just where a broad shelf of stone furnished a commodious landing place. It was the very spot where the red caps had landed. Years had changed the more perishable features of the scene, but rock and iron yield slowly to the influence of time. On looking more closely, Wolfert remarked 3 crosses cut in the rock just above the ring, which had no doubt some mysterious signification. Old Sam now readily recognized the overhanging rock under which his skiff had been sheltered during the thundergust. To follow up the course which the midnight gang had taken, however, was a harder task. His mind had been so much taken up on that eventful occasion by the persons of the drama, as to pay but little attention to the scenes, and these places looked so different by night and day. After wandering about for some time, however, they came to an opening among the trees, which Sam thought resembled the place. There was a ledge of rock of moderate height, like a wall on one side, which he thought might be the very ridge whence he had overlooked the diggers. Wolfert examined it narrowly, and at length discovered 3 crosses similar to those on the above ring, cut deeply into the face of the rock, but nearly obliterated by moss that had grown over them. His heart leaped with joy, for he doubted not that they were the private marks of the buccaneers. All now that remained was to ascertain the precise spot where the treasure lay buried, for otherwise he might dig at random in the neighborhood of the crosses without coming upon the spoils, and he had already had enough of such profitless labor. Here, however, the old negro was perfectly at a loss, and indeed perplexed him by a variety of opinions, for his recollections were all confused. Sometimes he declared it must have been at the foot of a mulberry tree hard by, then beside a great white stone, then under a small green knoll a short distance from the ledge, until at length Wolfert became as bewildered as himself. The shadows of evening were now spreading themselves over the woods. The rock and trees began to mingle together. It was evidently too late to attempt anything farther at present, and indeed Wolfert had come unprovided with implements to prosecute his researches. Satisfied, therefore, with having ascertained the place, he took note of all its landmarks, that he might recognize it again, and set out on his return homewards, resolved to prosecute this golden enterprise without delay. The leading anxiety, which had hitherto absorbed every feeling, being now in some measure appeased, fancy began to wander, and to conjure up 1,000 shapes and chimeras as he returned through this haunted region. Pirates hanging in chains seemed to swing from every tree. Their way back lay through the desolate garden, and Wolfert's nerves had arrived at so sensitive a state that the flitting of a bird, the rustling of a leaf, or the falling of a nut was enough to startle him. As they entered the confines of the garden, they caught sight of a figure at a distance, advancing slowly up one of the walks, and bending under the weight of a burden. They paused and regarded him attentively. He wore what appeared to be a woolen cap, and, still more alarming, of a most sanguinary red. The figure moved slowly on, ascended the bank, and stopped at the very door of the sepulchral vault. Just before entering it he looked around. What was the affright of Wolfert when he recognized the grisly visage of the drowned buccaneer! He uttered an ejaculation of horror. The figure slowly raised its iron fist and shook it with a terrible menace. Wolfert did not pause to see any more, but hurried off as fast as his legs could carry him, nor was Sam slow in following at his heels. Away then did they scramble through bush and brake, nor did they pause to breathe, until they had blundered their way through this perilous wood, and fairly reached the high road to the city. Several days elapsed before Wolfert could summon courage enough to prosecute the enterprise, so much had he been dismayed by the apparition, whether living or dead, of the grisly buccaneer. In the meantime, what a conflict of mind did he suffer! He neglected all his concerns, wandered in his thoughts and words, and committed 1,000 blunders. He babbled about incalculable sums, fancied himself engaged in money digging, threw the bedclothes right and left, in the idea that he was shoveling away the dirt, groped under the bed in quest of the treasure, and lugged forth, as he supposed, an inestimable pot of gold. End of section 13.